Hello, class. This is the lecture for the Girardet readings, chapter 2 and 3. We're going to start with chapter 2, which is called Agropolis. So, the beginning of chapter 2, Girardet references von Thunen's isolated state as a land use model, as a good way to. Girardet uses this as a good way to think about the basic relationship between human settlements and nature. The essence of this model is that humans are embedded in their local landscapes. The model is called an isolated state because it makes the assumption about how a city might develop if it was cut off from other settlements and couldn't rely on long distance trade. If that were the case, certain factors such as distance, cost, freshness, these things all create constraints on how land can be used. So land use is then determined by these constraints. That's why you start to see these sort of concentric circles form. The idea was that anything that required immediate consumption, such as milk, or was expensive or heavy to transport, such as timber, would be located closer to the center of the city. Goods that could be stored longer, such as grain, or were easier and less expensive to transport, could be stored farther away from the city. The isolated state model is an example of what Girardet calls agropolis. Agropolis is a generalized traditional settlement type characterized by a necessarily circular relationship with its hinterlands. Settlements could only emerge in places of natural abundance, where energy sources were things like water, wind, burning timber, muscle power. The important thing in these agropolis arrangements is that human settlements had to live within these constraints, the constraints of their natural surroundings, the constraints that their hinterlands produce. They could not exceed the carrying capacity of land, that is. Reciprocally, the land had to be cared for. So crops had to be rotated, manure and compost had to be returned to the soil. In other words, there wasn't a lot of room for waste. So this all changed with the Industrial Revolution. So vast areas of arable land became closed off and privatized in order to build factories and create factory towns. Cities began to grow rapidly throughout Europe. Inner cities became quickly overcrowded and conditions there deteriorated. Places like Manchester in England became well known for being filthy and disease-ridden. This is the problem that actually led to the birth of modern planning. We can safely say that urban planning is fundamentally an environmental discipline then. So as a response to the Industrial Revolution, many European countries began to set aside urban land to grow food, especially for the poor people, the working poor and so forth, the people that had moved from rural areas into the city. So a lack of green spaces such as parks were also assumed to be a malady of dirty industrial cities. And as a result, many urban designers and planners started working urban green spaces into their plans. Maybe the most famous case of this is Central Park in New York City, which was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in the mid-1800s. So plans for cities started to resemble agropolis in many ways. Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities, for example, proposed moving people away from overcrowded areas to greener areas of lower density where property was commonly held and settlements were not to exceed roughly 30,000 people. World War II also had a monumental impact on settlement patterns. Many central cities were completely destroyed during the war, and as a result, millions of people moved to suburban new towns, they were called, in England. These new towns were loosely modeled on Ebenezer Howard's model of garden cities. So these new towns were largely unsuccessful, though, because the common ownership rights that were sort of imbued as part of these developed new towns were dissolved by the central government of England, and then the assets of these towns were privatized. In the U.S., it was Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City that most resembled Howard's Garden Cities. Wright argued that human settlements needed to be spread out rather than concentrated because at the time, concentration of people, density was actually seen as a problem. This is how diseases spread. This is how the sort of dirt and grime of these industrial cities was kind of getting out of hand. Wright reasoned that if human settlements were spread out and we were more purposeful about the way we designated land use and so forth, the relationship that people had with land be more intentional and so forth. Obviously, these somewhat utopian aspects of Frank Lloyd Wright's and Ebenezer Howard's plans had never really played out. Instead, we ended up with these sprawling suburbs, as we see them today. This actually segues well into Chapter 3, which is a little more substantial than Chapter 2. So Chapter 3 is called Petropolis. It is as it sounds. It has to do with cities that rely on coal. It's basically saying that cities today do rely on coal, oil, gas, and so forth, the fossil fuels that are imported from far away, from distant places rather than energy sources that are locally available. So this is the big difference. In Agropolis, energy sources were local and land uses were constrained by what was locally available. In Petropolis, energy sources are imported from distant places. Petropolis has its roots in the Industrial Revolution and the mode of production that the Industrial Revolution gave birth to. This mode of production allowed places to pull wealth, which wealth we might start thinking of it as nature transformed into other forms, other objects for consumption, commodities, and so forth. The mode of production that Petropolis birthed allowed wealth to be pulled from faraway places. Girardet says that Petropolis is sort of part consumer demand and part political support. He estimates that about $2 trillion in global subsidies go to fossil fuels. And it was also largely made possible by the invention of the steam pump in the early 1700s. This allowed access to underwater and underground fossil fuel sources for the first time in history. And then at the same time, or shortly thereafter, commonly owned lands throughout Europe were beginning to be enclosed by the decree of European governments. Particularly, this was happening in England. So these enclosures consolidated the ownership of land into the hands of small and increasingly wealthy elites. They also meant that rural people that lived on those lands were evicted from those lands and had to migrate somewhere else. A lot of times this was to cities where they could find work. And at the time, cities were rapidly growing because of this. So places like Manchester, which Girardet says grew by over 3,000% in 90 years during the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s. This resembles, obviously, what we were talking about the first week of class with the rapid growth that we see in Asia and Africa. These industrial cities, especially in England, but also in the United States, were pretty bleak places. Life expectancy in England was 18 years, roughly 18 years. That's pretty amazing. Another important factor was the rapid expansion of rail lines between cities. So this allowed trade to happen faster than it had ever been able to happen before. And in light of these historical transformations brought on by the Industrial Revolution, Girardet wants to turn our attention towards the differentiation between two important concepts. And this is sort of where he goes with the rest of the chapter. So the first is this idea of an urban footprint, and the second is this idea of an ecological footprint. So these are very different things. An urban footprint is the total amount of land that a city occupies, whereas an ecological footprint is the amount of land needed to support the urban population. So the ecological footprint, in other words, considers the regional and global hinterlands of cities. This includes the land needed to grow food, to mine fossil fuels, to grow trees that absorb carbon, to house waste that's produced by urban populations, and so on. Planners and policymakers have sought to control the urban footprint with policy tools like land use zoning and urban growth boundaries, but not much policy has been focused on managing ecological footprints. This is mainly because of the enormous challenge of working cooperatively across distances with other countries and other government agencies. It should be said that urban and ecological footprints widely vary. Population is not the only determinant here. Girardet uses the example of the difference between the urban and ecological footprints of Atlanta, Georgia, and Barcelona in Spain. So despite similar population numbers, which I think is somewhere around 2.5 million. Atlanta takes up 26 times more land mass. The amount of driving alone makes Atlanta's ecological footprint a great deal higher. There's also big inequalities between cities in terms of ecological footprint. For example, by 1870, London was already drawing on resources from all over the world. And by 1995, London's ecological footprint would have been larger than the entire UK. That's England, Scotland, and Wales. So if every city had the ecological footprint of London, we would need 3 or 4 Earths just to support that degree of consumption. So the ecological toll expended by cities has been very damaging to indigenous populations, especially indigenous populations that still live within the bounds of nature's limits. This toll is more than just the conversion of natural resources into commodities. It also comes in the form of biodiversity loss, climate change, overfishing, sewage runoff, and agricultural runoff, and so on. As a solution for policymakers, Girardet turns to the notion of ecological rucksacks. These ecological rucksacks are an accounting device that account for the total stress exerted on the environment to extract a single resource. The example that he uses is that 1 gram of gold is equivalent to 400 kilograms of rock and soil. This is all displacement, right? The rucksack concept helps to understand the true cost of resource extraction and consumption. These hidden impacts of extraction, production, and consumption, commonly referred to as externalities. In the US, resource extracting entrepreneurs historically learned how to capitalize on vertical integration in industries such as steel and timber. So the development of raw materials facilitated the rapid development of transportation routes, which were important for distributing these materials. As a result, cities grew rapidly as labor forces agglomerated around production facilities in rapidly growing industrial cities such as Detroit, Pittsburgh, even New York City. Developments in fossil fuel consumption allowed commodities to be shipped further afield, allowing entire regions to become specialized. For example, you see fruits and vegetables grown in California, grains and meats from the Midwest, like Kansas and Nebraska. You saw steel in Pittsburgh, and so on. Eventually, the car came to dominate in the U.S., and infrastructure was constructed rapidly to accommodate cars. Girardet argues that now we live in an era of mobilization rather than civilization. He means that people can move around so quickly and freely without considering the ecological impacts of this mobility. These impacts are largely also engineered to be invisible to the people who are moving around. And like Cronin does in Chapter 1 of Nature's Metropolis, Girardet lastly wants to make some points about the economy. He says that urbanization is largely driven by finance and speculation and the need to find the highest and best use on urban land. Urbanization is especially rampant in the age of neoliberalism. We'll spend a little time in class talking about this term neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is often thought of in context with globalization. It's often used interchangeably with globalization and the so-called Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus consists of the following points. It asks governments to avoid large public debts, or what might be called austerity programs. It focuses on market-based interest rates. Very important to the Washington Consensus was free trade, or what we might say as like the dissolution of import tariffs and taxes. The Washington Consensus demanded liberalization of federal direct investment flows, which again is the removal of tariffs and taxes on, it's called FDI, so foreign direct investment. The privatization of public services. Water is especially a big thing here, but pretty much everything, healthcare, education, anything that was public, that was typically public, supported by the public sector. They encouraged privatization of those things. Also big was the deregulation of financial institutions to allow capital and money, finance, and so forth, more of a free flow. Also, a big protection of property rights, including intellectual property. Lastly, there is and we'll talk about this a little bit more in our next class, the idea of structural adjustment for developing countries, the economies of developing countries. These are often tied to conditional loan packages from global banking institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. Neoliberalism also involves a global rather than local or regional labor market. This is the first time in history that the world had seen something like this. This is also why we see manufacturing jobs shift to places like Asia and Mexico. So entire regions of the globe are now specializing, whereas before we were talking about places like California specializing. Now entire regions of the globe are specializing in certain types of labor. Girardet closes by acknowledging some of the impacts of this form of globalization, neoliberal globalization in particular, which has been one of the things has been the collapse of industrial cities in the global north, places like Detroit. And this is actually a really good setup for what we're going to be reading about next week, which largely has to do with some of the effects of globalization on local ecologies. We'll see examples from slums in the global south, as well as take a closer look at cities like Detroit in the global north. These are all places that are deeply affected by the new ecology of globalization. So with that, I'll wrap this lecture up. If you haven't already, make sure you watch the other lecture on Cronin. Yeah, thanks for watching.